Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited cities on the surface of the earth. Some archaeological estimates place human settlement there at more than 10,000 years ago, making it a place that has watched empires rise and collapse, watched rivers change their courses, watched the desert creep and retreat across entire geological epochs. It sits in the Jordan Valley, roughly 846 feet below sea level, making it not only one of the oldest cities in the world, but also one of the lowest. The air there carries a particular quality, heavier, warmer, shot through with the mineral scent of the Jordan River not far to the east, and the dry mineral scent of the Judean desert to the west. In winter, when the hills of Jerusalem were cold and grey under overcast skies, Jericho was mild enough to feel like a different climate altogether. Palm trees lined its streets. Balsam trees, harvested for their extraordinarily valuable aromatic resin, grew in cultivated groves that had made certain landowners in the region very wealthy indeed. By the time of Jesus, it was a thriving city, cosmopolitan by the standards of the ancient Near East, sitting at the intersection of several important trade routes. It was a city that Rome had reorganized, that Herod the Great had ornamented with his characteristic architectural ambition: a winter palace, an amphitheatre, a hippodrome. Jericho had seen conquerors and traders and pilgrims and prophets. It had been the first city the Israelites encountered when they crossed the Jordan under Joshua, and the story of its walls falling at the sound of trumpets was part of the cultural memory of every Jewish person who walked through its streets. The city was layered, ancient beneath ancient beneath ancient, and it knew it. There was a consciousness about Jericho, a sense of accumulated history pressing up through the limestone and the soil. The road through Jericho was never a quiet place. During festival seasons, and this particular passage took place as Passover approached, when tens of thousands of Jewish pilgrims were making their way up toward the holy city, the road would have been choked with travellers. You can imagine the layered sound of it if you try, the low rumble of cartwheels on packed earth, the bleat of animals being led to market or to sacrifice, the overlapping conversations of families and merchants and religious teachers with their disciples, the laughter of children who had not yet learned that the journey was supposed to be solemn, the soft chanting of pilgrims who kept the psalms of ascent on their lips as they walked, all of it moving together in one great slow human tide, pointed toward the holy hill of the city that sat above everything else in the landscape and consciousness of Jewish life. The air would have smelled of dust, of cook fires lit along the road, of livestock and the particular warm, slightly sweet smell that large crowds of people produce when they have been travelling under the sun. And beneath all of it, faintly, the smell of the date groves just beyond the city's edge, that particular sweetness that was so associated with Jericho that the Romans called it the City of Palms. Into this world Jesus arrived. He was travelling with his disciples, 12 of them, though the number who followed loosely was considerably larger, and with a crowd of supporters and curious onlookers that had been gathering around him throughout his ministry in Galilee and Judea and the surrounding territories. These were people who had attached themselves to his movement for different reasons. Some had witnessed healings. Some had heard him teach and found that something in the quality of what he said struck them as different from anything they had heard before. Not the careful, qualified, citing of authority's approach of the scribes, but something spoken with a kind of direct authority that was either astonishing or alarming depending on where you stood in relation to the religious establishment. Some had heard stories and were trying to evaluate for themselves whether the stories were true. Some were pilgrims headed to Jerusalem who had simply found themselves walking alongside the same person their whole caravan was talking about. The crowd moved with him the way water moves around a stone, reshaping itself to accommodate his presence, pressing close, always orbiting. His disciples formed an inner ring, the crowd formed an outer one, and the road moved with all of them. And somewhere along the edge of that road, in the place where the dust settled thickest, in the gap between the moving crowd and the city wall, or the tree line, or whatever feature of the landscape defined that particular stretch, sat Bartimaeus. The name itself tells us something worth pausing over. In the Aramaic and Hebrew tradition, the prefix bar means son of. So Bartimaeus translates directly as the son of Timaeus. Mark's Gospel is the only one of the 4 Gospels that gives us this man's full name. The parallel accounts in Matthew and Luke speak simply of a blind man, or in Matthew's version, 2 blind men sitting by the road. The presence of a specific name in Mark has fascinated biblical scholars for a very long time. Why does Mark name him? One prominent theory is that Bartimaeus was known within the early Christian community, that he had, after his healing, become a follower of Jesus and remained connected to the communities that eventually produced the Gospels. If that is the case, then the people hearing Mark's Gospel read aloud in their gatherings, in house churches scattered across Judea and Syria and Rome, would have heard the name Bartimaeus and nodded, because they knew him or knew of him. He was not simply a character in a story, he was a person still present, or recently present in their midst. The detail of his name transforms the passage from a report about a miracle to something closer to a personal testimony, a memory preserved by someone who was still around to confirm it. But on this day, on this road, Bartimaeus is simply a man in the dust. He cannot tell you what the date palms look like from his angle on the ground. He cannot see the colours of the crowd, the deep-dyed blues and browns of travelling cloaks, the white linen of the wealthier pilgrims, the colours of Jericho itself. Cannot see the faces of the children running alongside the procession, cannot see the particular way the afternoon light slants across the Judean hills in the hours before sunset, turning the limestone from white to honey to copper to bronze in the slow sequence of late afternoon. He has not seen those things, perhaps ever, depending on whether his blindness was from birth or had come upon him later. His world is built entirely from sound, from touch, from the intricate patterns of daily experience that he has learned to read, the way a sailor reads weather in the colour of the horizon or the behaviour of birds. He knows the sound of a quiet morning versus a busy one. He knows the difference between a crowd passing on ordinary festival business and a crowd that has gathered around something specific, around a person or an event that has pulled people out of their normal forward momentum. And on this afternoon, as the sound of the approaching crowd first reaches him from down the road, something in the quality of it is different. There is an energy in it that he has learned to recognise but has rarely heard at this intensity. A particular electric quality of collective excitement that is not the ordinary buzz of commerce or pilgrimage. There is something almost crackling in it, something that ripples ahead of the moving mass of people, like the pressure wave ahead of a storm. He reaches out, perhaps, and catches the sleeve of someone moving past. He asks. Or perhaps he simply listens carefully, turning his head slightly to better gather the sounds, passing the fragments of conversation that float toward him in the general noise, and then he hears the name, Jesus of Nazareth. Part 2, A Life Lived in the Margins. Before we follow what happens next, take a moment to truly inhabit the life of Bartimaeus, not in a clinical, observational way, not as a study or an exercise, but really sit with it. Really let it settle around you like the dust of that road, because the Gospel writers do not give us a backstory. They drop us into a single afternoon in Jericho, and suddenly here he is, a man who has been here before, who will be here again tomorrow if this day ends the way every other day has ended. But a life preceded this afternoon. Years and years of ordinary days, each one shaped by the same fundamental parameters of limitation and dependency, and the slow erosion of hope that comes from hope repeatedly deferred. Consider what it meant to be blind in first century Judea, and consider it without the softening that comes from reading these stories at such great historical distance. There was no structured support system in the modern sense, no social services agency, no disability pension, no institution that existed specifically to provide for people whose physical condition prevented them from working. The options available to someone who could not work, who could not farm, because farming requires you to see where you're going, who could not carry goods for merchants because you need to see where you're placing your feet on a mountain road, who could not weave or build or trade, were narrow to the point of cruelty. You depended on the generosity of family members if you had them and if they had the means. You depended on the charitable giving that Jewish law encouraged and that a genuinely pious community would provide. If neither of those options was sufficient, you begged. You sat at the gate of a city or at the edge of a busy road and you held out your hand and you waited and you hoped, and sometimes people dropped coins and sometimes they walked past without slowing. There was also a theological dimension to the situation that would have made it worse in ways that go beyond material deprivation. The prevailing understanding in some Jewish circles of the time held that illness and physical suffering could be a consequence of sin, either the person's own sin or the sin of their parents. This was not a fringe or unusual view. It was sufficiently mainstream that we see it appear, unremarkably, in the conversations of Jesus' own disciples. In the 9th chapter of John's Gospel, when the disciples encounter a blind man at the gates of Jerusalem, Their immediate response is to ask Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" They are not being cruel when they ask that question. They are applying the theological framework they have absorbed from their culture, and Jesus characteristically refuses the framework entirely. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but the fact that the disciples ask it at all, the fact that it is their first, instinctive, unreflective question, tells us how deeply embedded that assumption was, which means that a man like Bartimaeus was not simply poor, he was not simply physically disabled. In the eyes of a meaningful portion of the people who passed him on the road, his suffering was evidence of something, a stain, a consequence, a mark of divine displeasure, however unjustly that judgment had been rendered. There was shame attached to his condition that went beyond the practical humiliation of begging. He was a person about whom the simplest explanation available to the surrounding culture was that he deserved this, and he sat with that day after day by the side of the road. To be Bartimaeus was to occupy a peculiar social position, invisible and yet somehow also conspicuous, noticed only to be stepped around, or noticed only to be made uncomfortable, or noticed the way you notice a familiar piece of furniture that has always been in a room, registered, categorised and immediately disregarded. People in Jericho had learned to walk past him the way you learn to walk past anything that has been in the same place long enough to become part of the expected landscape. He was feature, not event, background, not foreground. And yet he kept coming back to that road, every day, or most days presumably, unless the conditions were so severe that even the most desperate did not venture out. He made his way from wherever he slept to his spot by the road. He settled himself into the dust. He arranged whatever he had with him, his cloak, perhaps a bowl or a mat, in the way that experience had taught him made people most likely to be generous. He turned his face toward the sound of the traffic. He held out his hand, he listened, and he waited. There is something in that act of daily persistence that deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. It would have been so easy, so completely understandable, so rational, so defensible, to simply stop, after years of this, after the accumulated weight of being ignored and pitied and talked over and stepped around, after the theological shame, after the social invisibility, after however many thousands of coins dropped into his hand by people who did not look at his face when they dropped them, to simply give up on the road and retreat into whatever interior life remained available to him would have been a decision that no one could have criticised. Most of us would have made it long ago, but he came back. Every day he came back. And then one day, the crowd on the road has a different sound. He has heard stories, probably, fragments of stories at least. The name of Jesus of Nazareth is not unknown in the region. Word travels along the trade routes the way everything travels, slowly at first, building, then all at once, carried by merchants and pilgrims and travellers who stop at wells and at the gates of cities and who talk. There have been healings reported, not the kind that one occasionally heard attributed to various healers and holy men, the kind that were always second-hand and always vague, but specific healings of specific people with specific conditions, healings that had witnesses and names attached to them. A leper cleansed near Capernaum. A paralysed man lowered through a roof by friends and sent home walking. A woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years who touched the edge of his garment and was immediately healed. A dead girl raised. Thousands of people fed on the side of a hill with what had started as 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And the teachings. People talked about the teachings. About a sermon given on a hillside that rearranged the moral landscape. About words spoken in synagogues with an authority that was different from anything the rabbis produced. Not an authority that derived from citing earlier authorities, but an authority that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere primary and direct. You have heard it said, but I say to you. And the confrontations with the religious establishment, those careful, watching men who had begun to circle him with their questions, trying to find an angle of attack, and a title used by certain people, spoken sometimes quietly and sometimes not quietly at all, Son of David, the messianic designation, the one whom the prophets had described, the one who would come and restore and renew, the one promised to the house of David as an eternal heir. Some said it and meant it, some said it and were not sure what they meant, but the title was in circulation and Bartimaeus had heard it. He knows in this moment, as the crowd and its strange electric energy moves toward him down the road, that this is the person, and something in him, something that has survived years of dust and dismissal, and the slow grind of a life that the world has decided does not count, makes a decision. He opens his mouth. Part 3. The voice that would not be quiet. He does not calculate his odds. He does not take stock of the social situation and determine whether this is the appropriate moment, whether there is a better way to approach this, whether he ought to wait for a formal introduction, or a quieter stretch of road, or some kind of permission from someone in authority. He has spent years in a position where the conventional rules of social engagement have already excluded him. He does not have the luxury of patience about the form when the substance of everything is passing by him right now. He simply opens his mouth and cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The words erupt from him with the force of something that has been building for a long, long time. This is not a polite request murmured at a respectful volume. This is not the tentative, apologetic murmur of someone who is unsure whether they have the right to take up space. This is a shout, raw and urgent and completely without apology, carrying all the accumulated weight of years of dust and invisibility and deferred hope, and the title embedded in that cry is no accident. Son of David is a messianic designation. It is a theological statement packed into a form of address. It announces a belief, not a hope, not a question, a belief about exactly who this person is. Bartimaeus is not simply calling out to a travelling teacher who might do him a kindness. He's making a declaration about the identity of the one he's calling to, and he's making it in public, in the middle of a crowd with no intermediary and no introduction. The crowd around him reacts immediately. They tell him to be quiet. This is perhaps one of the most humanly recognisable moments in the entire story, and it deserves extended reflection. Here is a blind beggar sitting at the side of a road, calling out in the middle of a large crowd following an important and increasingly controversial teacher. The people around him do not see a man with a legitimate need reaching out to someone who might be uniquely positioned to help him. They see a disruption. They see someone making a scene. They see someone without social standing or credentials inserting himself into a moment that is not meant for him, drawing attention in a way that is embarrassing and undignified, and from the perspective of people who have invested their own social and religious capital in following this teacher, potentially damaging. Their response is the response of crowds throughout human history to people who break protocol in the name of need. Shush him. Tell him to know his place. Tell him this is not the time, this is not the way, this is not appropriate. Get him to stop. But Bartimaeus does not stop. He cries out even louder. This escalation is one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in the New Testament, and it should not be flattened into something merely dramatic. The crowd tells him to stop, and his response is not to comply, not to mutter under his breath, not to fall into wounded silence, not to calculate whether trying again is worth the social cost. His response is to cry out with more urgency than before, not because he is reckless, not because he is belligerent or enjoys confrontation, but because he understands something about this moment that the crowd in its comfortable, forward-moving confidence does not understand. This may not happen again. Jesus is moving. The crowd is moving. The whole procession has its own momentum, its own gravity, its own forward direction. The road from Jericho to Jerusalem is not a long road, perhaps 27 miles, perhaps less. And once the procession has left the city limits, the distance between him and what he needs will only grow. If he does not make himself heard now becomes never. And so he shouts again, "Son of David, have mercy on me." There is a theology embedded in that persistence that is both simple and profound. It is the theology of someone who has decided that what he believes about who Jesus is demands a response proportional to that belief. If Jesus is who Bartimaeus believes he is, then letting him pass by quietly would not be humility. It would be a failure of faith. You do not sit quietly when what you have been waiting for is passing right in front of you. You do not worry about the opinions of the crowd when what is at stake is your entire life. The social cost of shouting is real but temporary. The cost of staying silent is permanent. His cry is also, in a very specific sense, a prayer. It uses the language of prayer, "Have mercy on me," that was deeply familiar within the Jewish tradition. The Psalms are full of this construction. It is the language of someone bringing themselves just as they are to the attention of someone with the power to help. No elaborate preparation, no ritual purity, no waiting for a better moment or a more qualified intercessor. Just the raw, direct, unmediated cry of a person who needs something and believes that the one who can provide it is within earshot. He cries out, and the crowd moves, and the noise continues, and for one brief, terrible moment, you might wonder whether anyone has heard him at all. Part 4, the crowd parts. Jesus stops. In the middle of a moving crowd, on a road where every footstep was pointed toward Jerusalem, where disciples and followers and curious onlookers and fellow pilgrims were all in motion, where the momentum of the whole procession had its own gravity and its own internal logic. Jesus stops. He halts. The crowd adjusts around him the way a river adjusts around a stone that has suddenly appeared in its course, first with confusion, then with accommodation. And he asks for Bartimaeus to be brought to him. Call him. 2 words, or 3, depending on the translation, and they are enough to change everything. The people who had been telling Bartimaeus to be quiet, the very same people who had looked at him with irritation or embarrassment, or the particular kind of impatience that the comfortable feel when confronted with the uncomfortable, those same people now turn back toward him and say something utterly different. Take heart. He is calling you. There is something almost ironic about this shift that is probably not accidental. The crowd that silenced him is now the crowd delivering the message of his summons. The voices that told him his need was not appropriate in this moment are now the voices announcing that he has been heard. They have become, somewhat awkwardly, the messengers of the very thing they were trying to prevent. And notice what they say to him. Take heart. Cheer up. Be encouraged. As if they understand in this moment how much it has cost him to keep calling, and want to cushion the turn with kindness, a kindness they were not offering him 30 seconds ago. Bartimaeus does not wait to process any of this. He throws aside his cloak. That cloak, a himation in the Greek, the outer garment worn by people of all social classes in that era, though the quality varied enormously, was almost certainly one of the only things he owned that had practical value across all conditions. In the cool of desert mornings and evenings it kept him warm. In the midday heat he could draw it over his head against the sun. At night it served as a blanket. Through the day, spread on the ground, it served as something to sit on, a defined space for him in the flow of public traffic, and, critically, something to catch the coins that people tossed toward him. It was his shelter and his livelihood and his only real piece of property simultaneously. It was a survival tool as much as a garment, and he throws it aside. He does not fold it carefully and set it to one side in case he needs it later. He does not hand it to someone for safekeeping. He throws it down. He releases it with the physical gesture of a person who has decided that they are not coming back to this spot, that this garment belongs to a life that is already over, even if the evidence for that ending has not yet fully materialized. The throwing aside of the cloak is a declaration made in action before the miracle has happened, a staking of himself on the thing he believes is about to take place. It is faith expressed not in words, but in the irreversible act of putting down the one thing that marks your old life. He springs to his feet. He moves toward the voice, a blind man in a crowd, moving toward a sound. Think carefully about what this requires. He cannot see where to step. He cannot see the people surrounding him, the gaps between them, the obstacles of feet and cloaks and walking sticks and the legs of animals. He cannot navigate with his eyes, cannot plan a route, cannot scan ahead for hazards. He has only the direction of the voice and the general sense of where the crowd has gone quiet around the figure at its centre. He moves through all of it, through the press of bodies and the unfamiliar ground, and the crowd, to its credit in this single moment, parts enough to let him through. He comes forward, stumbling perhaps, moving with the particular determined urgency of someone who knows that hesitation is not available to him. And he stands before Jesus. Part 5. What do you want? Jesus asks him a question. What do you want me to do for you? The question seems, on the surface, almost redundant. Bartimaeus is blind. He has just shouted that fact, implicitly, through the messianic address, through the urgency of his cry, across a public road. Surely it is obvious what he wants, and yet Jesus asks, he does not presume. He does not simply act without first creating a space for Bartimaeus to speak for himself, to state his need in his own words, to exercise the dignity of articulating what he desires. The question is a kind of gift, offered before the greater gift that follows it. Consider what the question does. In a culture where Bartimaeus has been spoken over, spoken about, silenced, and ignored, a person with the power to actually change his situation turns to him and asks what he wants. Not what the crowd thinks he needs, not what the disciples assume would be appropriate. What do you, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, beggar by the road, person who has been sitting in this dust while the world moved past, want me to do for you? It treats him as a person with agency and interiority. It acknowledges that he has a perspective on his own situation that deserves to be named and heard. It refuses to help him anonymously, impersonally, as a category of need rather than as a specific human being with a specific desire. Biblical scholars have noted that this is the same question Jesus poses, just a handful of verses earlier in Mark's account, to the disciples James and John, who come to him with an ambitious request about positions of honour in the coming kingdom. They want to sit, one on his right and one on his left, in his glory. The parallelism seems intentional, a deliberate contrast. The disciples, who have had front row access to everything Jesus has been doing and teaching, ask for glory. Bartimaeus, a beggar on the side of a road who knows Jesus only by reputation and the sound of a passing crowd, asks for sight. The contrast is instructive and not entirely flattering to the inner circle, but there is another dimension to this question that goes even deeper. The asking is itself an act of respect for the faith that has already been demonstrated. Bartimaeus has already shown, in his persistent calling, in his disregard for the crowd's judgment, in his throwing down of the cloak and his springing to his feet, what he believes about who Jesus is and what he is capable of. The question honours that faith by taking seriously the person behind it. Bartimaeus does not hesitate. He does not hedge. He does not offer a conditional statement or qualify his request with apologies for taking up space. Rabboni, he says, or in some manuscripts simply Rabbi. The word carries deep respect, somewhere between teacher and master, an address that acknowledges a relationship even before one has been formally established. And then, simply, directly, without adornment, I want to see. 3 words in most English translations. In the Greek, anablepso, let me see again, or simply, that I might see. The word itself is uncomplicated and completely unambiguous. There is no hedging in it, no false modesty, no preemptive apology for asking too much. He knows exactly what he wants, and he says it exactly. He has had years sitting by that road to know what the one thing was, and when the moment comes to ask for it, he is ready. Part 6. The moment light returns. Go, Jesus says, your faith has made you well. And immediately, the Greek word is euthys, a word that appears with remarkable frequency in Mark's Gospel, a word that carries the sense of instantaneous consequence, of something following immediately and inevitably from what preceded it. Immediately, Bartimaeus receives his sight. Try to inhabit that moment. Truly inhabit it. This is not a metaphor. This is not a gradual improvement. This is not a slowly clearing fog or a gentle brightening at the edges. This is the immediate total flooding in of light into a system that has known only darkness. A man who has navigated his entire existence through sound and touch, and the careful mental mapping of familiar environments, suddenly, completely, totally sees. The first thing he sees is probably light itself, pure, unstructured, overwhelming light. The visual cortex, processing input for the first time or for the first time in years, would have needed a moment to organise the information arriving from the optic nerves. But in those first fractions of a second, before the mind has organised form and depth and colour into coherent scene, just light, radiant, indescribable, impossibly present light. And then form begins to emerge from it, shape, colour, the particular arrangement of features that constitutes a human face up close. The sky above, the specific deep blue of a desert sky in the afternoon, a blue that has no real equivalent in any other climate, a blue that feels solid enough to touch, the crowd around him, the sea of faces all oriented toward this central figure, all looking at the same moment of miracle from the outside while he experiences it from within. The road stretching out behind and ahead. The city of Jericho, the date palms, the limestone hills, the the Jordan Valley opening out beyond everything. He sees all of it. For the first time, or for the first time in so long that it may as well be the first time, he sees. The Gospel accounts tell us very little about what he feels in this moment. There is no description of tears, no record of the first words that come out of his mouth after the darkness lifts, no slow dwelling on the emotional texture of the experience. The story moves with characteristic gospel efficiency past the moment of the healing itself and toward what Bartimaeus does next, as if the writers, Mark, Luke, understood that some things cannot be described adequately, that the attempt to describe them might actually diminish them. There are moments that are beyond the reach of language, that can only be approached obliquely, that must be left in their fullness to the imagination of the listener, who meets them with their own experience of darkness and light. So we will not try to fully describe it either. We will only note that it happened, that darkness became light, that the world, which had existed for Bartimaeus as a constellation of sounds and textures and temperatures, and the accumulated memory of what other people's descriptions told him to expect, suddenly opened into full, immediate, overwhelming visual reality. And then the story tells us what he does next. He does not walk back to his cloak. He does not find his old spot by the road and sit back down in it, stunned into stillness by what has just happened to him. He does not go home to wherever home is, to be with family, or to have time alone to process this. He does not even, as far as the text tells us, pause for very long. He follows Jesus on the road. The Greek word is akalotheo, to follow, to go along with, to accompany. It is the same word used throughout the four Gospels to describe what disciples do. It is the word that appears when Jesus says, "Come, follow me," and Peter and Andrew leave their fishing nets by the Sea of Galilee. It carries the weight of intentionality, of commitment, of joining one's own direction to someone else's. Bartimaeus, in the first moments of his sight, looks at the person who has given it to him and makes a decision about where he is going next. He follows. The road ahead of him leads up through the Judean wilderness toward Jerusalem. It is steep and rocky and long. It passes through terrain that has sheltered bandits and wild animals and travellers who have not survived the journey. It leads into a city where enormous forces are gathering around Jesus. Forces of enthusiasm from the crowds who want to crown him. Forces of alarm and hostility from the religious and political authorities who have been watching and waiting for an opportunity. Bartimaeus follows into all of that, with open eyes. Part 7. Layers of the story. What is this story really about at its deepest level? Because like all the great stories of Scripture, it operates on multiple frequencies simultaneously. It speaks differently depending on where you are in your own life when you encounter it. And it has spoken differently to different generations across 2,000 years, which is probably one of the reasons it has survived every generation. On one level, it is a story about the nature of faith when faith is inconvenient. Bartimaeus is not a man who can exercise his faith in a quiet, socially acceptable, carefully managed way. He has no resources, no connections, no ability to secure an audience through normal channels. He cannot write a letter or arrange a meeting or have a mutual acquaintance make an introduction. The only tools available to him are his voice and his refusal to be silenced. His faith is loud. It is pushy. It is, by the social standards of the crowd surrounding him, embarrassing and inappropriate and entirely without the dignity that religious expression is supposed to have, and it produces exactly the result it seeks. There is a very specific teaching from Jesus in the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, placed directly before the account of Bartimaeus in Luke's narrative, that addresses this dynamic head-on. Jesus tells the parable of a persistent widow and an unjust judge. The widow keeps coming before this judge, who fears neither God nor people, and keeps asking him to grant her justice in a case against an adversary. The judge refuses for a long time, but eventually, purely because she will not stop coming, he grants her request. Not because he has changed, not because he has been moved by compassion or convinced by argument, but simply because her persistence has worn down his resistance. The lesson Jesus explicitly draws from this parable is, do not lose heart, do not give up. Keep bringing your need to the one who has the power to address it, and trust that persistent prayer is not shameless. It is faithful. The Bartimaeus account, coming immediately after this parable in Luke's Gospel, reads almost as a living illustration of that teaching. Here it is, happening. Here is what the persistent widow looks like in practice. Here is what refusing to give up sounds like when it is coming from a man in the dust by a road in Jericho. On another level, this is a story about a particular kind of divine attention. Attention that moves in exactly the opposite direction from human attention. The crowd does not see Bartimaeus, or rather they have learned not to see him, which is a different and in some ways more troubling thing. He is visible to them in the minimal sense of being a physical object that they have to navigate around. But he is not seen in the fuller, richer sense, not seen as a person with a story and a need and a legitimate place in the moral attention of the people passing him. He has become furniture, part of the landscape. The crowd's attention is forward, is upward, is directed at the significant figure at their centre, and Bartimaeus is definitionally not that. But Jesus stops. In the middle of all that forward motion and momentum, he stops. He hears a voice that the crowd has decided does not deserve to be heard, and he stops the whole procession for it. The divine attention moves toward the one that human attention has learned to move past. This pattern runs through the biblical narrative with remarkable consistency. It is the pattern of the shepherd who leaves the 99 to find the one who has wandered off. It is the pattern of Elijah at the lowest point of his ministry, broken and fleeing through the wilderness to a cave at Horeb, reached there by the still small voice. It is the pattern of the father in the parable of the prodigal son, who sees his returning child from a long way off and runs toward him, not waiting for the child to arrive and explain himself, but running. The attention of God in the biblical narrative consistently and specifically turns toward the overlooked, the forgotten, the ones sitting in the dust at the edge of the road. Bartimaeus did not need to be visible to the crowd in order to be visible to the one whose attention mattered most. His cry, sustained, escalating, unashamed, reached the ears it needed to reach, and the procession stopped. There is also, embedded in this story, something important and worth naming about the relationship between healing and the willingness to leave the past behind. The cloak is not a minor detail. The cloak is the story's most compressed symbol, the one image in which the whole dynamic of transformation is caught. To throw it down is to say, the life I have been living, structured around this limitation, arranged around this particular form of dependency and survival, that life is over. I'm not preserving it as a contingency. I'm not folding it neatly and setting it aside in case this does not work out. I'm releasing it. Because you cannot fully receive what is ahead of you while your hands are still holding on to what was behind you. This is a theme that appears across many of the healing narratives in the Gospels. The paralysed man at the pool of Bethesda is asked by Jesus whether he wants to be healed, and the question is genuine, because there are people who have organised their entire lives around their illness, and who, if pressed, are not sure they want the disruption that recovery would bring. The disciples are repeatedly asked to leave behind nets, tax booths, family obligations, before they can follow. Transformation, in the Gospel accounts, is almost never merely additive. It is not simply a matter of receiving something new, it almost always involves releasing something old, and the releasing is the act of faith that makes the receiving possible. Bartimaeus does not know, when he throws down the cloak, that he is going to receive his sight. He knows that he believes it. He knows that he is moving toward the one he believes can give it. The cloak is released in the space between faith and fulfillment, in that gap where the miracle has been asked for but not yet given, which is, of course, precisely where every act of genuine faith lives. Part 8. The Road to Jerusalem. The road that Bartimaeus walked after his healing was not an easy road. The procession he joined was moving toward Jerusalem during one of the most politically volatile Passover seasons in recent memory. The city was packed with pilgrims. Estimates of the Passover crowds in Jerusalem during this period range into the hundreds of thousands, and the Roman occupiers managed the festival with the particular combination of logistical efficiency and suppressed anxiety that defines any occupation's management of a subject people's major cultural event. Extra soldiers, heightened surveillance. A prefect, Pontius Pilate, who spent most of the year in the more comfortable coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, but made the trip to Jerusalem for Passover precisely because the crowd dynamics required his personal presence. Into this charged atmosphere, the movement surrounding Jesus was arriving with its own complicated energy. The crowds greeting the procession were enthusiastic to the point of making the authorities nervous. Palm branches, cloaks spread on the road, the title, Son of David, being shouted in public. a messianic title that had specific political implications about Jewish independence and the restoration of the Davidic kingdom. The religious authorities who had been manoeuvring against Jesus for months were watching all of this and calculating when and how to act. Within days of Bartimaeus receiving his sight on the road outside Jericho, the crisis that all of this had been moving toward would arrive. Bartimaeus followed Jesus into all of it. He followed into the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, into the overturning of the money changers' tables in the temple, into the increasingly charged confrontations with Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees, who came one after another with their carefully constructed questions designed to trap or discredit. He followed into the last days of that final week, through whatever he was able to witness or hear or piece together from the reports of others. We do not know what Bartimaeus saw when the arrest happened. We do not know if he was among the crowd that gathered outside the praetorium during the trial. We do not know where he was on the Friday when the crucifixion took place on the hill outside the city. The Gospels do not tell us. They give us his name and his healing and his following, and then they move on. But the fact of his name, preserved with such specific care by Mark, including the name of his father, suggests that he continued, that whatever those last days of that week meant to everyone who had been following, whatever the crucifixion did to the hopes that had been built up along the road from Jericho and 1,000 roads before it, Bartimaeus came through the other side. He was still there, in some form, in some community, known enough to be named in a document that was being read aloud to gatherings of people who had made an enormous and costly commitment to believing that the story did not end on that Friday. He went from sitting on the side of the road to walking on it, from being passed by to moving forward, from darkness to light, and then on into all the complicated, difficult, beautiful terrain that light reveals when it falls on a world that was previously invisible to you. Part 9. What Remains. There is something that happens to people who have come through genuine darkness, in whatever form that darkness takes, and emerged into light. Something changes in the quality of attention they bring to the world. They do not take the light for granted the way that people who have always lived in it tend to do. They notice it. They notice it in a way that those who have always been able to see cannot quite replicate, because the noticing requires the contrast, the before and after that gives the present moment its full weight. The particular quality of afternoon light on stone, the way a face changes when it smiles, the particular geography of it, the way the lines deepen and the eyes change and the whole arrangement of features becomes something different and softer. The specific blue of a desert sky seen for the first time, or for the first time in years, a blue so particular to that landscape and that light and that altitude that it almost doesn't seem real. The way a crowd of people looks when you can see all the individual faces in it, rather than just hearing it as an aggregate of sound. The way depth works. The way far things are small and near things are large, and the space between them is real and measurable, and full of texture and movement. These things, which the rest of us register without truly seeing, become almost unbearably beautiful to the person who has come through darkness to find them. Bartimaeus walked into that beauty on a dusty road outside Jericho, and the first thing he saw, according to the logic of the story, if not its explicit statement, was the person who had given it to him. Moving ahead of him on the road, heading towards something, and Bartimaeus did what you do when the thing that has restored your life is moving ahead of you. He followed. The crowd that had told him to be quiet was now moving with him. The road that had been his daily station, the site of his limitation, the place where the world passed him by, was now the road of his continuation, his going forward, his new life unfolding step by step and mile by mile. The voice that everyone had tried to silence had produced not merely a healing, but a complete reorientation. The beggar by the road had become a person on the road. He had asked for one thing. He received everything. Consider for a moment what the act of following meant for Bartimaeus in the practical immediate terms of that afternoon. He had no preparations made. He had not packed for a journey, or arranged for someone to look after his affairs, or said goodbye to anyone he knew. He had thrown his cloak on the ground and walked away from it, and now he was joining a procession headed up through the Judean hills toward the most politically charged city in the region, at the most politically charged time of year. He did not know what was coming. He could not see the next week any more than he had been able to see the road before his healing. He was following step by step in real time, with no guarantee about what the road would bring, which is, of course, the only way following ever works. Faith, in the biblical tradition, is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is not a state of perfect knowledge about how things will turn out, or a guarantee that the road ahead will be free of danger or difficulty. Faith is precisely the act of moving forward when you cannot see the whole picture. It is the willingness to commit to a direction based on what you believe about the one you are following, even when the details of the route are hidden from you. Bartimaeus, who had spent years unable to see, began his new chapter of sight by doing the thing that sight could not actually show him, following someone into an unknown future on the basis of faith. The road from Jericho to Jerusalem climbs. If you have walked it, or driven it, you know the way the landscape changes as you ascend, with flat alluvial plains of the Jordan Valley giving way to the dry sculpted limestone hills of the Judean wilderness, the vegetation thinning, the views opening up, the city of Jerusalem appearing on the horizon and growing slowly larger with each mile until you arrive at its walls and its gates, and its extraordinary, complicated, layered holiness. It is a journey that has meaning built into it, the ascent toward the holy place, the elevation both physical and spiritual. Bartimaeus made that journey with open eyes for the first time. Part 10. Blind seeing and seeing blindness. One of the things that makes the story of Bartimaeus particularly resonant within its gospel context is the way it plays against a recurring theme in the Gospel of Mark. Mark's gospel is deeply interested in a specific irony. The people who can see, in the physical sense, often cannot see the truth that is right in front of them, and the people who are physically blind sometimes perceive the truth with extraordinary clarity. The disciples, the 12, the inner circle, have been with Jesus throughout the entire ministry recorded in Mark's account. They have witnessed every healing, heard every teaching, been present for the feeding of the thousands, been in the boat during the storms, been on the mountain during the transfiguration. They have had more access to what Jesus is doing and saying than any other human beings alive, and yet Mark's gospel returns again and again to their failure to understand. They argue among themselves about who is the greatest. They try to prevent children from being brought to Jesus. They fall asleep in Gethsemane. They flee when the arrest comes. Peter denies him 3 times. The disciples who can see are often blind. Bartimaeus, who cannot see, perceives with remarkable clarity. He uses the messianic title, Son of David, a title that carries enormous theological and political weight, a title that the disciples themselves have not always been confident about deploying in public. He persists in his belief through social opposition. He does the thing that faith calls for without calculating the cost or waiting for permission. He throws down his old life and leaps toward the new one with a decisiveness and urgency that stands in sharp contrast to the disciples' frequent hesitation and confusion. He cannot see, and he sees more clearly than almost anyone else in the story. This irony is not accidental. It is part of the gospel's sustained argument about where genuine perception comes from. Seeing the truth in the Gospel of Mark is not primarily a function of how much access you have had to information. It is a function of what you are looking for and what you are willing to believe. Bartimaeus, sitting in the dust with nothing to protect and nothing to prove, encounters the question of who Jesus is and answers it immediately, completely, and with his whole life. The disciples, who have everything, frequently stumble over the same question. The placement of the Bartimaeus story at the end of Jesus' journey toward Jerusalem, at the literal threshold of the final week, is significant. It is as though Mark is saying, before we enter the city, before we go into the events that will test everything and shake everyone, here is a portrait of what genuine faith looks like. Here is the model, not the disciples with their arguments and their confusion and their eventual flight. Not the religious authorities with their careful questioning and their political calculations. Here, this man, this voice, crying out from the dust, refusing to be silenced, leaping toward what he believes, walking forward with open eyes. That is what we are watching as we enter the city. That is what we are trying to do. Part 11. A meditation for the night. There is a particular kind of prayer that most of us know, but that we rarely acknowledge as prayer. It is the cry that comes from a place that is too far down for language to fully access. Not the composed, grammatically correct petition offered in a quiet room, but the raw, urgent, barely articulate call that rises from the gut when you have run out of alternatives and there is something passing by that represents your only real hope. It sounds like desperation to the people around you, but it is, in its own way, the purest form of faith there is. Bartimaeus' cry was that kind of prayer. It was not elegant. It was not performed for an audience. It was not calibrated to achieve a particular effect or to present himself in the most favourable possible light. It was the sound of a man who needed something and who believed, with everything in him, that the one passing by could give it to him. And he made that sound without apology, without calculating whether this was the right moment, without looking around to see whether the people nearby approved. Most of us, at some point in our lives, have a Bartimaeus moment. A moment when we are sitting by the side of the road while everything else seems to be moving. A moment when something we have needed for a long time seems to be passing by, and we have a choice about whether to call out or stay quiet. The world has its own crowd, its own set of people who will tell us that our need is not appropriate right now, that we should wait for a better moment, that the urgency we feel is embarrassing, that this is not how things are done. The story of Bartimaeus is a story for those moments. It says, cry out anyway. It says, the crowd is not the final word on whether your need deserves to be heard. It says, what you throw down to move forward is not lost. It is released, and that releasing is the act of faith that opens the door to what is coming. It says, you do not need to see the full road to take the next step on it. And it says, perhaps most powerfully of all, sometimes, in the middle of all the noise and all the forward motion, and all the perfectly legitimate concerns that make a crowd keep moving, sometimes it stops for you. Not because you earned it. Not because you were patient enough or quiet enough or dignified enough or appropriately positioned by all the relevant social standards, but because you would not stop calling out, and the one you were calling to had been listening all along. Part 12, the closing road. It is night now, wherever you are, and somewhere in the ancient landscape of Judea, unchanged in its essential character across 2,000 years of human history, still limestone and desert air, and the particular darkness that settles over hills that have no artificial light to hold it back. The stars are coming out. They come out over the Jordan Valley differently than they do over cities, slowly at first, one by one, until the sky begins to fill, and then all at once, until the darkness is almost incomprehensibly full of light. The Milky Way becomes visible as the kind of thing it actually is. A river of stars, a band of the galaxy, more stars than you can count or even look at without feeling something shift in your chest. A sky like that has been seen by human beings across all of recorded history and beyond. Bartimaeus, before his healing, knew it only as the absence of sight, as the particular quality of darkness that follows sunset, as the change in temperature and sound that marks the transition from day to night. And then one afternoon, a voice on a road stopped the procession of an entire city's worth of pilgrims, and his faith, raw and inconvenient and beautiful in its desperation, was answered. And then there was the night sky. For the first time, or for the first time in so long that the memory of it had dissolved into the general darkness. All those stars. Imagine looking at the sky for the first time after years of not seeing it. Imagine the particular quality of astonishment that would produce, not the familiar, habitual, taken-for-granted astonishment that most of us feel when we look at a particularly clear night sky, but genuine first-sight wonder. The kind of wonder that has nowhere to anchor itself because it has nothing to compare the experience to. Just the sky, just the stars, just the incomprehensible depth of the universe opening up above a person standing on a road outside an ancient city, who that morning had been sitting in the dust expecting another ordinary day of darkness and invisibility. There is a man who sat by a road in Jericho, and his name was Bartimaeus, and he refused to let the crowd's opinion be the final word on whether his need would be heard. He called out until the calling was answered. He threw down the only security he had when the moment came to move. He leapt toward a voice through a crowd in his darkness without seeing where his feet were falling, and he came out the other side into light. His story is not a relic from 2,000 years ago, sealed in the amber of ancient history and unreachable from where we sit. It is a story that breathes. It is a story that finds its way into the situations where we feel overlooked, and into the moments when we are tempted to be quiet when we should be calling out. It is a story about what faith sounds like when it is not worried about what the crowd thinks of it. The road is long, and sometimes the road requires us to throw down the cloaks we have been using for safety and leap toward what we can hear but not yet fully see. But sometimes, in the middle of all the noise and all the forward motion and all the perfectly reasonable reasons the crowd has to keep walking, the procession stops, and the voice that asks what you want is patient enough to wait for your answer. And the answer, when it comes from a real place in you, is enough. Rest now. Let the city of Jericho settle into the still, warm quiet of your imagination. Let the road go still beneath you. Let the crowd disperse, slowly, into the softness of the night. Let the desert darkness come down around you, slow and vast and full of stars. And somewhere in that darkness, in the space between waking and sleep where the deepest things become most clear, notice something quiet and certain. You are seen. Not by the crowd, not by the noise, but by something older and quieter and more patient than all of it combined. Something that heard a man shouting from the dust of a road in Jericho and stopped a whole procession to hear him better. Something that asks what you want and waits genuinely for your answer. You are seen. Picture a city so vast, so ancient, so fortified that its people have long since stopped imagining any threat. Picture walls that stretch so high they seem to press against the underside of heaven itself. Picture streets lit by torchlight, and somewhere near the centre of it all, the glowing windows of a palace filled with noise, music and laughter and the clattering of cups, the smell of roasted meat drifting through corridors of polished stone, the sound of thousands of voices rising in celebration. This is Babylon. And tonight, in the year 539 before Christ, something is about to happen that no one inside those walls can predict, and no one outside them will ever forget. The night has barely begun, and already time is running out. The Great Feast. His name was Belshazzar, and he ruled the greatest empire on earth. He was the son of Nabonidus, the reigning king of Babylon, though Belshazzar held the practical day-to-day authority as co-regent, the man who commanded the palace, the men, and the ceremonies. He had grown up surrounded by gold. He had grown up breathing the air of power so completely that it had become invisible to him, the way fish do not notice the water they swim through. On this particular night, Belshazzar had decided to hold a feast. Not a small gathering, not a quiet royal dinner, a feast in the grandest Babylonian tradition, a display of excess so deliberate, so theatrical, that it was itself a kind of announcement, a declaration that said, "We are untouchable. We have always been untouchable, and we will always be untouchable." 1,000 nobles filled the great hall. Think about that number for a moment. 1,000 men of standing, of rank, of wealth, all gathered in a single space, all drinking, all speaking at once. The sound alone would have been staggering. Voices bouncing off stone ceilings, servants moving between tables in long lines, the music playing from somewhere near the entrance, harps, horns, the rhythmic beating of percussion, providing a constant undertow of sound beneath the conversation. Babylon, in these centuries, was extraordinary by any standard of the ancient world. Its walls were so wide that, according to the historian Herodotus, chariots could be turned around on top of them. The Euphrates River ran directly through the city. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were said to have been built here, green terraces rising like a mountain in the middle of the flat Mesopotamian plain. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its temples were famous across the known world. Its gods were considered powerful enough to have shaped the very cosmos. To be Babylonian, and especially to be Babylonian royalty, was to believe, not arrogantly, simply as fact, that you stood at the centre of civilization itself. Belshazzar lifted his cup. The feast continued, and somewhere beyond the city walls, in the quiet darkness of the plain, an army was already moving. A dangerous decision. There is a moment in every story where a character makes a choice so reckless, so tone-deaf to the weight of what they are doing, that it functions almost as a signal, a flare sent up from the narrative to say, this is where it turns. Pay attention here. For Belshazzar, that moment came in the middle of the feast. He had been drinking. The wine was flowing freely, as it does at any celebration where the host wants his guests to feel that nothing is being held back. And in that particular loosened state, that place where inhibition softens and the distance between an impulse and an action becomes dangerously short, he made a command. He ordered the sacred vessels to be brought in. These were not ordinary cups. These were not goblets from a conquered city, or trophies from a local campaign. These were the gold and silver vessels that had been removed from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the holiest site in the entire Hebrew tradition, during the conquest of Judah under his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. They had been captured and stored in Babylon as spoils of war, yes, but they had also, in the intervening decades, accumulated a particular kind of weight. They were known. Everyone who mattered knew what they were, where they had come from, and what they represented. They represented the presence of the God of Israel. And Belshazzar, king of Babylon, drunk and celebratory and deeply certain of his own invulnerability, decided to use them as party cups. The vessels were brought out. They were distributed among the nobles, among the wives, among the concubines. Wine was poured into them. And Belshazzar raised one of those sacred cups, that specific gold vessel that had once stood inside the most sacred room in Jerusalem, and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron, of wood and stone. He was not simply being careless. He was making a statement. He was saying, the God of the Hebrews is no God at all. His temple has been emptied. His people have been scattered. His vessels are my party favours. Whatever power he may have had, it clearly did not protect the ones who worshipped him. It was a declaration of cosmic arrogance, and it was heard. The hand. The feast was loud. Voices, music, the clinking of those sacred vessels, the laughter of 1,000 nobles who had eaten well and drunk deeply and who had, for the moment, forgotten that the world outside Babylon's walls existed at all. And then, silence. Not sudden silence. Not the kind that crashes like a wave. Something stranger. The kind of silence that begins at one point and spreads outward. The way cold spreads from a single open window until everyone in the room is still and looking in the same direction, and no one quite remembers when they stopped talking. They were looking at the wall. The wall of the palace was plastered white, a smooth, pale surface near one of the great lampstands, where the light fell cleanest and brightest, and on that wall something was appearing. A hand, not a full figure, not a face, not a voice from above, just a hand, the part of a human hand from the fingers to the wrist, moving slowly, deliberately, carving letters into the plaster, writing words, and then stopping. The hand did not retreat dramatically. It did not gesture. It simply appeared, wrote what it wrote, and was gone. What remained were the letters, carved or traced into the surface of the wall in the bright light of the lampstand, visible to every person in the room. King Belshazzar, who moments before had been the most powerful man in the city, changed colour. The texts say his face turned pale, and they use a word in Aramaic that suggests not simply paleness, but a draining, a going out of something, as if the vitality that had been there a moment before had simply left his body. His thoughts frightened him. His knees knocked together, his legs gave way beneath him. This is a king, a man who has commanded armies, a man who has hosted 1,000 of the most powerful people in his empire, and presided over the entire spectacle with the ease of someone born to such things, and he is on the floor, because he saw a hand write on a wall, and he knew, with the kind of certainty that bypasses all argument, that what he had seen was not a trick. It was not a hallucination produced by wine. It was real, and it was meant for him, and it was not good. The wise men fail. The king's voice, when he found it, was urgent. "Bring in the enchanters," he said. "Bring in the astrologers. Bring in every wise man in Babylon. Whoever can read this writing, whoever can tell me what it means, will be clothed in purple and wear a gold chain around his neck and be named the third highest ruler in the kingdom." These were extraordinary rewards. Purple clothing in the ancient world was among the most expensive and exclusive things that existed. The dye came from a specific species of sea snail, and it took thousands of them to produce even a small amount of the colour. To wear purple was to announce, to everyone who saw you, that you were connected to royalty. The gold chain was a symbol of rank and favour that carried real social meaning, and the title of third highest ruler, given that Belshazzar himself occupied the second position under his absent father, was about as high as a person could rise in a single night. The wise men of Babylon filed in. These were not frauds or amateurs. The Babylonian tradition of divination, astrology, and interpretation was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. For centuries, the priests and scholars of Babylon had been cataloguing celestial events, compiling libraries of omens, and developing detailed systems for reading the meaning of natural phenomena. They had interpreted dreams, they had read entrails, they had mapped the stars with a precision that would influence astronomy for thousands of years. They looked at the writing on the wall, and not one of them could read it. This detail is easy to pass over, but it is actually extraordinary. These were men whose entire professional existence was built around interpreting signs and symbols. This was literally their one function, and whatever was written on that wall, in whatever script or language or form, was beyond all of them. The king's distress, which had been volcanic when the hand first appeared, grew worse. His face told his nobles everything, and the nobles themselves, those 1,000 powerful men who had been feasting with such confidence, were now thrown into confusion as well. The celebration was over. The room had become something else entirely. And the Queen arrived. The Queen's Council. She has no name in the text. She's simply the Queen, and scholars have debated for centuries whether she was the Queen Mother, Belshazzar's own mother, or perhaps the wife of the late Nebuchadnezzar. Whatever her precise relationship to Belshazzar, her entrance changes the story. She walks into a room full of frightened men, the king among them, and she is, in that moment, the calmest person present. She speaks with authority. "O king, live forever," she says, the formal greeting. "Do not be alarmed, and do not let your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father," and here she means Nebuchadnezzar, "light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." She's describing a man who, by this point, had likely been in Babylon for decades. A man who had served under one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world and had never once been wrong. A man who had interpreted dreams that no one else could approach, who had navigated the politics of an empire with integrity and survived, who had been thrown into impossible situations and come out the other side, not just intact, but elevated. His name was Daniel. In Hebrew, the name means "God is my judge." And as the Queen continued speaking, reminding Belshazzar of Daniel's history, of his track record, of the particular quality of wisdom that seemed to flow through him, the room shifted. There was someone who might be able to help. There was still a possibility that the night would not end in complete darkness. "Bring Daniel," the king said, and Daniel was brought in. Daniel before the king. He was an old man by now. Daniel had been brought to Babylon as a young captive during the early deportations from Jerusalem, probably sometime around 605 before Christ. If the Feast of Belshazzar took place in 539 before Christ, that would put Daniel somewhere in his late 70s or even older. He had outlasted every royal court he had ever served. He had seen Babylon at its height and watched it begin to hollow from within. He walked into the great hall, past the remnants of the feast, past the sacred vessels still sitting on the tables, past the 1,000 nobles who had been celebrating an hour before, and he stood before the king. Belshazzar made his offer again, the purple, the gold chain, the title of third ruler. Whatever Daniel needed to interpret the writing on the wall, Daniel's response is one of the most dignified in all of Scripture. "Keep your gifts," he said. "Give your rewards to someone else. I will read the writing to the king and tell him what it means." He was not rude. He was not contemptuous. He simply made it clear, quietly and without drama, that what he was about to do had nothing to do with payment. He had not come because of the rewards. He had come because this was what he was called to do, and the rewards were beside the point. Then he turned to the king, and instead of going straight to the message on the wall, he delivered something far more difficult: a reckoning. The accusation. Daniel spoke plainly. He reminded Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar. He reminded him that the great king, his predecessor, the builder of the empire Belshazzar now enjoyed, had been given a greatness so immense that all peoples, nations and languages trembled before him. He could kill anyone he wished. He could spare anyone he wished. He was for a time as powerful as any human being who had ever lived, and it had destroyed him, because Nebuchadnezzar had become proud. He had looked at his empire and thought, "I built this. This is mine." And God, the God of Israel, the God Daniel served, had removed the greatness from him. He had been driven out of human society and had lived among wild animals, eating grass like an ox, his hair growing long like eagle feathers, his nails curling like the claws of a bird, until 7 years had passed and he had finally lifted his eyes toward heaven. Until he acknowledged that it was not his own power that had raised him, until he understood that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. Nebuchadnezzar had learned. He had been broken and then restored, and at the end of his life he had known something real. And then Daniel looked directly at Belshazzar. "You are his successor," Daniel said. "You knew all of this. You knew what happened to him. You knew why it happened, and you have not humbled your heart. Instead, you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the vessels of his house brought before you, you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines, and you drank wine from them, and you praised gods of silver and gold, of bronze and iron, of wood and stone, which do not see, which do not hear, which do not know. But the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways, you have not honoured." In all the literature of the ancient world, it is difficult to find a moment quite like this. An old man, a captive foreigner with no army and no political power, standing before a king on the highest throne in the world and speaking to him with complete and unblinking honesty about the exact nature of his failure. Belshazzar did not interrupt. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps some part of him already knew that what Daniel was saying was true, and that knowing it made silence the only possible response. And then Daniel turned to the wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The words on the wall were in Aramaic, the common diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, and they read as follows: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. On their surface, these words appeared to be weights, units of monetary measurement. Mene was a mina, Tekel was a shekel, Peres, the singular form of Upharsin, was a half mina, or alternatively a word that sounded very much like the word for Persia. They were accounting terms, measurement words, the kind of language you might use at a market or in a treasury, which is why the wise men could not interpret them. They could read the letters. Any literate person could have read the letters. The mystery was not the letters, it was the meaning behind them, and that meaning required a different kind of reading entirely. Daniel explained. Mene, he said, God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. The word carried within it the idea of counting, of a measure being taken, of an accounting being completed. Belshazzar's kingdom had been counted, evaluated, assessed, and the assessment was finished. The number was complete. Tekel. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. This was the image of a merchant's balance, the kind used to weigh silver and gold. Belshazzar himself had been placed on one side of the scale, and when the measure was taken, he had not been enough. He was light. He was deficient. Whatever standard was being applied, whatever the scale was measuring, Belshazzar did not meet it. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The word played on two meanings at once, the word for divided and the name of the empire that was, at that very moment, positioned outside the walls of Babylon. The split was not metaphorical, it was immediate. Tonight. 3 words, 3 sentences, the entire verdict of an empire delivered in the space of a breath. Think about what it must have been like to stand in that room and hear this. 1,000 people, the cream of Babylonian society, gathered for what was supposed to be the celebration of their own greatness. And instead they were hearing an old man tell their king that it was over, that God had counted and found the number complete, that the scales had been brought out and the kingdom had come up short. The silence in that room must have been absolute. The rewards. Belshazzar kept his word. This is one of the small, strange details of the story, that even in the face of what had just been announced, even knowing that Daniel had delivered news of the kingdom's destruction with zero softening, the king followed through. He dressed Daniel in purple. He put the gold chain around his neck. He issued a proclamation that Daniel would be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. There is something almost poignant about this. The proclamation meant nothing. The kingdom had hours left. The title of 3rd ruler was about to be a title over nothing. The purple robe and the gold chain were symbols of a power structure that was, even as they were being placed on Daniel's body, beginning to dissolve. But Belshazzar honoured his word. Perhaps it was the only honourable thing left to him. Perhaps some part of him was making peace with the fact that the night was over. Perhaps he simply did not know what else to do, and doing the expected, formal, courtly thing felt like the last solid ground available. Whatever the reason, the feast did not resume. The story does not tell us of any further celebration, any attempt to regain the mood, any effort to return to what the evening had been supposed to be. The guests were still there. The food was still on the tables. The sacred vessels were still sitting where they had been placed, but the music had stopped. The fall of Babylon. In the ancient world, a city like Babylon was not supposed to fall in a single night. Sieges in that era were long affairs. You surrounded a city. You cut off its supply lines. You waited. Weeks passed. Months passed. Sometimes years. The defenders exhausted their food and their water and their will, and eventually they opened the gates, or the walls crumbled, or a plague moved through the city and settled the matter by attrition. Direct assault on a city as fortified as Babylon was not merely difficult, it was, by most military calculations of the time, essentially impossible. The walls of Babylon were, by ancient accounts, approximately 85 feet tall and nearly 25 feet thick. The city had been engineered to withstand any assault any enemy could imagine, and it was supplied by the Euphrates River, which ran directly through it, meaning it had fresh water and could theoretically sustain itself indefinitely against a siege. The army of the Medes and Persians, under the command of Cyrus the Great, had been positioned outside the city for some time, but no one inside Babylon was particularly worried. The city was impregnable. History said so. Logic said so. The walls said so. What Cyrus did was something no one anticipated. He diverted the river. His engineers redirected the Euphrates upstream, lowering the water level inside the city to a point that made the channels running beneath the walls, the gaps where the river entered and exited the city, shallow enough for soldiers to wade through. And on the night of Belshazzar's feast, while the king was drinking wine from the sacred vessels of Jerusalem, and his wise men were failing to read the writing on the wall, and an old man named Daniel was delivering a verdict, the Persian army was moving through those channels in the darkness. They came in under the walls, not over them, not through them, under them, along the riverbed, in the night, while the city was distracted and celebrating and failing to post the kind of guard that you post when you genuinely believe a threat is real. The ancient historian Herodotus writes that the Babylonians at the centre of the city did not know the outer sections had already been taken until the enemy was nearly upon them. The city was so large that the fall of one gate did not immediately communicate itself to the palace district. The news travelled inward while the army travelled inward simultaneously. Belshazzar was killed that night. The text of Daniel gives the detail plainly and without drama. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. No great scene, no dramatic last stand. One moment he was the king of the greatest empire on earth. The next, he was not. And Darius the Mede, a ruler connected to Cyrus the Great, received the kingdom. The transfer of the greatest empire in the ancient world happened in the span of a single feast. What the historians say. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge that the story of Babylon's fall in 539 before Christ is one of the most historically documented events of the ancient world. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a cuneiform clay tablet discovered in the 19th century and now housed in the British Museum, records the fall of Babylon to Cyrus in significant detail. It notes that the city was taken without a battle in the conventional sense, that Cyrus entered the city peacefully, and that the inhabitants welcomed him. The Cyrus cylinder, another remarkable artifact, records Cyrus's own account of the conquest, and his policy of allowing deported peoples, including crucially the Hebrews, to return to their homelands. The details in the Book of Daniel, the co-regency of Belshazzar, the involvement of the Medes and Persians the night of the fall, have been subjects of significant scholarly debate over the centuries, with some historians questioning the specifics and others finding them consistent with what we know from archaeological sources. What is not in doubt is the broad historical reality. Babylon fell to Cyrus in 539 before Christ. The city that had seemed permanent was taken. The empire that had seemed eternal ended. What the Book of Daniel adds to this history is the interior layer. Not just what happened, but what it meant. Not just the mechanics of a river being diverted and soldiers wading through channels, but the question of why, of what spiritual and moral accounting was happening simultaneously with the military one. And that is the layer that has kept this story alive for 2,500 years. The meaning beneath the words. Let us stay with the image for a moment. A hand writes on a wall. Not a voice, not a dream, not a vision experienced alone in the night. A hand, visible, physical, present, writing words in the middle of a feast, in a room full of people, under bright light. A public sign, an unmistakable sign. Something that could not be explained away as imagination, or misremembering, or the product of too much wine, because 1,000 people saw it simultaneously. Why a hand? Scholars and theologians have reflected on this for centuries. Some note that the hand, specifically the hand without a body, emphasizes the divine transcendence of the action. It is not a human hand, and yet it is recognizably a hand. It belongs to something beyond the room, and yet it acts within the room. It participates in the physical world, touching the wall, moving through space, producing marks that remain after it is gone, without being fully contained by the physical world. Others focus on what the hand does. It writes. In a world where writing was associated with permanence, legal documents, temple inscriptions, royal decrees, the act of writing something was not casual. Written words were meant to last, and yet this writing, appearing on the plaster of a palace wall, was almost immediately followed by the destruction of the palace itself. The written verdict outlasted the verdict reader by only hours. The words themselves, mene, mene, tekel, uparsin, have entered language as a phrase that transcends the story. You have likely heard the expression "the writing is on the wall" used in everyday life, describing a situation where the signs of coming disaster are present and legible even if no one wants to read them. The phrase lives in modern English, in dozens of languages, in the title of songs and novels and films, a 2,500-year-old shorthand for the idea that fate announces itself before it arrives, if only we are willing to look. Tekel, you have been weighed and found wanting, has become equally resonant. The image of the scale, of a life or a kingdom being placed on one side and measured against something that cannot be bribed or charmed or argued with, speaks to something deep in human moral intuition. There is a measuring happening. It is always happening. And the standard being applied is not the standard of human approval or human success or human power. It is something older, something that does not change based on who is holding the feast. Pride and its architecture. The story of Belshazzar is, at its deepest level, a story about the architecture of pride. Pride, in the theological tradition that produces this story, is not simply vanity or arrogance in the everyday sense. It is something more specific and more dangerous. It is the conviction that one's own position, one's own power, one's own achievements are products of oneself alone. That the gifts one has been given are, in fact, possessions one has earned, and that one therefore owes nothing to anyone beyond the boundaries of one's own will. Nebuchadnezzar had gone down this road before Belshazzar. He had stood on the rooftop of his palace and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" And the text says that the words were still in his mouth when the judgment fell. 7 years in the wilderness. 7 years of humiliation so complete and so physical that it was impossible to explain away. 7 years that broke him down to the point where he could acknowledge at last that the greatness had not come from him. He recovered. He was restored. And at the end of his life, Nebuchadnezzar seems to have carried within him a genuine understanding of what had happened to him and why. Belshazzar had watched this. He had not simply heard a rumour of Nebuchadnezzar's story. He had grown up inside it. He was the inheritor of an empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built and then nearly lost. And he knew the circumstances under which that near loss had occurred. Daniel says it to him directly. You knew all of this. You knew what happened and why and what it meant, and he did it anyway. This is the part of the story that functions almost as an additional indictment. It is one thing to make a mistake out of ignorance. It is another to watch a predecessor make that mistake, observe its consequences, and then recreate the conditions that produced it as exactly as possible, as if the lesson had never been taught at all. The sacred vessels were not an accident. Belshazzar knew what they were. He knew where they had come from. He knew which god they had been dedicated to. He chose them specifically, perhaps because the choice felt like a demonstration of power, a proof that the God of Israel was unable to protect even his own temple furniture. It was, in its way, a dare, and the dare was answered. The Sleepless City. There is something I want you to hold as you rest tonight. Babylon was not asleep when it fell. That is the strange irony at the centre of this story. The city was wide awake. It was celebrating. Every lamp was lit. Every hall was full. Every noble was present and accounted for and actively engaged in the festivities. The streets in the palace district were alive with the noise of a kingdom at its most celebratory. And yet it fell. The city that was most alert was most unguarded. The city that was making the most noise could not hear the sound of soldiers moving through its waterways in the dark. The light of 1,000 lamps inside the palace made the darkness outside its walls more absolute, not less. There is a meditation in this for anyone who has ever mistaken noise for security, who has ever filled a room with people and music and celebration and assumed that fullness was the same as safety. Who has ever been so certain of the walls around them, the professional walls, the financial walls, the social walls, the walls of habit and reputation and accumulated success, that they could not imagine what it would mean for those walls to be gone by morning. Babylon's walls were real. They were among the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world. They had stood for generations. They would stand for generations more after the events of this night. The walls did not fail. The walls were simply irrelevant, because the threat did not come through the walls. It came through the river, the very source of the city's life, the water that fed it, that allowed it to sustain a siege indefinitely, was redirected and became the path of its undoing. The thing that was supposed to protect Babylon was the thing that allowed Babylon to fall. Daniel in the silence. And through all of it, through the feast, through the handwriting on the wall, through the failed wise men and the terrified king and the proclamation, and the gold chain and the purple robe, Daniel remained exactly who he had always been. He did not celebrate Babylon's fall. He did not gloat over Belshazzar's terror. He did not use the moment to extract revenge or advantage for himself or his people. He simply did what he had always done. He spoke the truth as clearly and completely as he could to whoever was in the room with him, regardless of the consequences. He had done this under Nebuchadnezzar. He had done it in the lion's den. He would continue to do it under the Medo-Persian Empire that replaced the Babylonian one. He outlasted empires not by adapting his convictions to match whoever was in power, but by holding to something that remained constant regardless of who was in power. This is one of the most consistently striking things about the figure of Daniel across the text that bears his name. He is not invulnerable. He is not particularly powerful in a conventional sense. He has no army. He has no political base of his own. He is a foreigner in a country that has conquered his homeland. And yet he persists, decade after decade, in speaking honestly about what he sees and believes, and in refusing to be purchased by rewards that he could have had at any point by simply telling people what they wanted to hear. On the night of the feast, he could have softened the message. He could have found some way to interpret the writing that was less final, less damning, less completely devastating to the man who held his future in his hands. He could have accepted the gifts first, and then delivered a more moderate verdict. He refused the gifts entirely and told the king exactly what the wall said, because in his understanding the gifts were irrelevant. They were Belshazzar's. The truth was not Belshazzar's to give or take away. The night as mirror. Every culture that has ever existed has produced stories about the fall of great things. The Greeks wrote about Troy. The Romans catalogued the fall of every civilization that preceded them, perhaps sensing that they too would one day be catalogued. The ancient Egyptians, for all their obsession with permanence, their pyramids, their mummification rituals, their elaborate mythology of the afterlife, were deeply aware that the pharaohs who built those monuments were themselves impermanent. Power ends, dynasties collapse. The things that seemed most fixed are the things that, with sufficient distance of time, look most fragile. What makes the story of Belshazzar different is not the fall itself. Kingdoms had fallen before. Kingdoms would fall after. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus, historically significant as it was simply one in a long succession of imperial transitions that stretched backward into prehistory and forward into our own era. What makes it different is the feast. The fall of Babylon is unusual because it happened in the middle of a party. The king was not at the walls. He was not in the throne room receiving bad news. He was not in the middle of a council of war or a desperate strategic meeting. He was celebrating. He was at the height of his social and ceremonial self, surrounded by the most powerful people in his empire, performing the ritual of dominance that rulers perform when they want to remind everyone, including themselves, that they are secure. And that is precisely what makes it such a powerful mirror for something that seems to recur across human experience in every era. The way that our most public performances of certainty are sometimes the exact moments in which we are most blind to what is actually happening. This is not a medieval story. This is not a story that requires us to believe in empires or feasts or the specific theological framework of ancient Babylon to recognize its shape. The shape is familiar. We have all known, in smaller registers, in personal rather than imperial contexts, the experience of being most confident at the moment before something changed, the experience of the party that felt most solid right before the news arrived, the moment of greatest professional assurance right before the landscape shifted, the relationship that felt most settled right before the conversation that unsettled everything. The writing was on the wall long before anyone saw it. It is always on the wall. The question is only whether we are willing to look up from the feast long enough to notice it. The vessels and what they carry. There is a detail in the story that I find myself returning to again and again. The sacred vessels. I want to spend a moment with them, not just as historical objects, but as symbols. because the text gives them a significance that goes far beyond their material value. These were not simply gold and silver cups. They were objects that had been made for a specific purpose, consecrated to a specific use, and located in a specific place. The innermost courts of the temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred architectural space in the Hebrew world. They had been used in worship. They had been part of rituals that, in the theology of ancient Israel, connected the physical act of ceremony to something that existed beyond the physical entirely. When Nebuchadnezzar took them from Jerusalem, he placed them in the treasury of his own god, Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. This was a standard practice in the ancient Near East. When you conquered a people, you took their sacred objects as a way of demonstrating that your god had defeated their god. The captured vessels were proof of divine superiority. They were theological trophies, but they were also, in the Babylonian system, still treated with a certain degree of reverence. They were stored in the temple treasury, not thrown into a pile of household goods. They were respected as what they were, even if they were now in the possession of the conquerors. What Belshazzar did was something different. He did not simply keep them as trophies. He took them out, and he used them for wine. He turned objects that had been made for worship into party cups. He did not do this accidentally or casually. He gave the order intentionally, specifically, while already drinking and already in the grip of the mood that excess creates. He chose those specific vessels because the choice itself said something. It was a statement, a performance. The statement was, there is nothing sacred here. There is nothing that my power cannot reduce to a tool for my own use. And the response came immediately. There is a theological principle embedded in this that has fascinated commentators for 2,500 years. It has to do with the relationship between the sacred and the profane, between things set apart for a particular purpose and things claimed for general use. The vessels were not inherently magical. They were not protected by some kind of divine force field that would zap anyone who touched them. Their significance was relational. They meant what they meant because of what they had been dedicated to. Using them for something else was not dangerous in a mechanical sense. It was dangerous in a meaning-making sense. It was a declaration about what you believed reality to be. And declarations have consequences, not because the universe is a vending machine that dispenses punishment in exchange for wrongdoing, but because the way we treat what is sacred, or what we believe to be sacred, or what we refuse to recognize as sacred at all, reveals something about the orientation of our lives. It reveals what we actually believe beneath the surface of what we say we believe. And in Belshazzar's case, that revelation was complete. There was nothing beneath the surface that contradicted the surface. He believed that power was power, that gods were tools, that the sacred was a concept that applied to others and not to him. He was wrong. And the wall said so. The archaeology of pride. We do not have to look hard in the modern world to find the architecture of Belshazzar's era. It is in every institutional collapse that begins with the belief that a certain organisation is too established, too prestigious, too fundamental to the landscape to fail. It is in the financial crises that are preceded by absolute confidence in systems so complex that their fragility is invisible until it is not. It is in the marriages that break apart while the couple is still performing happiness to the outside world. It is in the health that suddenly becomes serious after years of signs that were dismissed as minor. The walls were not the problem. Babylon's walls were real and impressive, and they worked. They did exactly what they were designed to do. The problem was not the walls. It was the belief that the walls were sufficient. The belief that the walls were the whole story. The belief that because the walls had held, they would always hold, and therefore the behaviour inside the walls required no particular examination. Belshazzar was not stupid. He was not simple. He was a man who had grown up in one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, who had been educated in the traditions of his culture, who had watched his predecessor rule an empire and had drawn the lesson that the empire was permanent. The very stability of what surrounded him made the idea of its ending feel abstract, theoretical, a thing that happened to other kingdoms, in other eras, for reasons that did not apply here. We know this feeling. We know it in the way we think about the things in our own lives that feel most stable, the job that has always been there, the relationship that has weathered everything so far, the health that has never given us any serious trouble, the community that has always been home. We do not consciously believe these things are permanent. We know intellectually that everything changes, but knowing it intellectually and metabolizing it as a lived reality are very different things, and between those two states, the intellectual knowledge and the embodied understanding, is a space where arrogance grows, not because we are bad people, but because stability is comfortable and discomfort is not. Nebuchadnezzar learned the lesson. Belshazzar watched it being taught and did not learn it. That gap between watching someone else's lesson and actually incorporating it into yourself is, perhaps, the most human gap there is. What remains? Babylon fell in 539 before Christ. The city itself endured for centuries afterward. It was not razed or destroyed in any sudden cataclysm. Cyrus the Great, in keeping with his unusual policy of relative tolerance, allowed the Babylonian people to continue their religious practices and did not dismantle the city. The Jews who had been held in captivity were given permission to return to Jerusalem. The sacred vessels, the gold and silver cups that Belshazzar had used to praise his gods on the final night of his reign, were returned as well. They went back to Jerusalem. The vessels that had been taken from the temple, that had travelled to Babylon as trophies of conquest, that had been stored for decades in the palace treasury, that had been brought out on one catastrophic night and used for wine. They made the journey home. There is something quietly remarkable about that detail. The cups outlasted the king. The cups outlasted the empire. The things that Belshazzar had commandeered as proof of his dominance over the God of Israel were, before the next generation had grown old, back in the possession of the people who had always considered them sacred. Not all stories of dominance end this way. Not all acts of desecration are answered with such specific reversal. But this one was. The wall was empty again. The writing had been read. The feast was over. And in the morning, in the strange quiet that follows the end of something that seemed permanent, the work of restoration had already begun. The figure of Daniel across time. Daniel is, in many ways, the most quietly extraordinary figure in the entire narrative. He does not perform miracles in this chapter. He does not call down fire from heaven or part a sea or raise anyone from the dead. He does not even pray in this passage, at least not in any way the text records. He simply walks into a room, declines a bribe, tells the truth, and walks back out. And somehow, that is enough to make him the most powerful person in the story. It is worth considering what the decades between the beginning of his captivity and this night must have looked like. Daniel had arrived in Babylon as a young man, a captive, far from home, his city destroyed, his temple emptied, his entire world overturned. He had been brought to the palace to be educated in Babylonian culture, language, and tradition. He had been given a Babylonian name. He had been subjected to a very deliberate program of cultural assimilation, and he had navigated it with remarkable precision. He had learned what there was to learn. He had excelled in the things that could be excelled in without compromising what he understood to be the core of his identity. He had served faithfully in positions of significant responsibility. He had interpreted dreams that had no natural interpretation. He had survived a den of lions. He had, by any reasonable measure, lived a life that should have broken him, or changed him beyond recognition. And instead he had arrived at his late years still, somehow, entirely himself. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, an extraordinary spiritual and psychological achievement. To remain yourself across decades of pressure requires an unusually clear understanding of what the self actually is. Most of us, when pressed, find that our sense of identity is more dependent on external conditions than we realised. We are who we are when things are going well. We are someone slightly different when they are not. We shift to accommodate the people around us, the institutions we belong to, the circumstances that reward certain behaviours and penalise others. This is not weakness. It is simply the normal human response to living in a social world. Daniel seems to have been unusually immune to this kind of drift. Not because he was rigid or defensive or closed to learning. The text makes clear that he was brilliant and adaptable in every domain that did not touch the core of what he believed, but because the core was genuinely load-bearing for him. It was not ornamental. It was not cultural decoration that could be set aside when inconvenient. It was the thing he was organised around, and removing it would not have been accommodation. It would have been dissolution. On the night of the feast, this quality expressed itself in the simplest possible way. He walked into a room where he could have become very rich by saying something less than true, and he said the true thing. There is a reason this story has been told for 2,500 years. There is a reason the phrase "the writing is on the wall" has survived into a language that did not exist when Belshazzar's palace stood. There is a reason Daniel's response to the king, "Keep your gifts, I will tell you what it means," continues to resonate in contexts that have nothing to do with ancient Babylon, or sacred vessels or cuneiform inscriptions. It resonates because the situation it depicts is not ancient. The situation is, a person who holds something you need is offering you a reward to say the thing that is comfortable, rather than the thing that is true. And the question the situation poses is, what do you do? Daniel's answer was so clear and so unhesitating that it did not even require a dramatic decision. He was simply already the kind of person for whom the question had only one answer. The decades of his life had been preparation for this exact moment, not because he had known the moment was coming, but because the habits of integrity that he had practiced in smaller circumstances had accumulated into a character that simply did not contain the option to do otherwise. He had not become inflexible, he had become clear, and clarity, when a hand is writing on a wall and a king is trembling on the floor, turns out to be the most powerful thing in the room. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the Bible's most overlooked blessings, I want to ask something that would mean the world to me. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel grow in ways you possibly couldn't imagine, and it allows me to continue bringing you these stories week after week. If you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review genuinely makes such a massive difference. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. It creates this amazing global community of people seeking truth, mystery and peace in these stories. And of course, if you enjoy what you hear tonight, subscribing to the channel ensures you never miss another deep dive into the stories that shaped history, faith and the human experience. Now let's talk about something powerful. Let's talk about a blessing so unexpected, so undeserved, that the man who received it wasn't even looking for it. There are moments in history when something sacred pauses, not because God withdraws, not because the blessing ends, but because people become afraid to move forward. Fear has a way of freezing progress. It halts celebration. It turns joy into anxiety. And sometimes, in those moments of collective paralysis, God finds someone who isn't looking for glory. Someone who simply says yes when everyone else is saying no. Tonight's story is about one of those people, a man whose name most Christians have never heard, a man who wasn't a prophet, wasn't a priest, wasn't royalty. He was simply available. And in his availability, he discovered something profound, that God's presence, when honoured rightly, doesn't bring destruction. It brings blessing beyond measure. This is the story of Obed-Edom, a man who became a footnote in Scripture, but whose quiet faithfulness reveals one of the most beautiful truths about how God works. Sometimes the greatest blessings come not to those who chase them, but to those who simply open their doors when everyone else has locked theirs. Let's begin with a celebration that ended in tragedy and a journey that stopped in the most unexpected place. Chapter 1. The Ark returns. The city of David was alive with anticipation. After years of waiting, after generations of separation, the Ark of the Covenant was finally coming home. King David had united the tribes, conquered Jerusalem, and now sought to bring the very presence of God into the heart of his new capital. This wasn't just a religious ceremony. This was the culmination of David's vision for Israel, a nation centered not on military might or political power, but on worship, on the presence of the living God dwelling among his people. The preparations had been extensive. 30,000 chosen men from Israel gathered for the occasion. Musicians practiced their instruments. Singers rehearsed their songs. The streets were decorated. The atmosphere was electric with expectation. The Ark itself carried profound significance. This wasn't merely a religious artifact. According to the accounts passed down through generations, this wooden chest overlaid with pure gold represented the very throne of God on earth. Inside it lay the stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the wilderness, and the staff of Aaron that had budded miraculously. But more than its contents, the Ark represented something Israel had lost, the manifest presence of God. Years earlier, the Ark had been captured by the Philistines during a disastrous battle. Though it had been returned after bringing plagues upon its captors, it had never made it to Jerusalem. It had remained in obscurity, in the house of a man named Abinadab, in a town called Kiriath-Jearim. Now David was bringing it home. The day of the procession arrived with perfect weather and perfect enthusiasm. The Ark was loaded onto a new cart built specifically for this purpose. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, guided the cart. They had grown up in the house where the Ark resided. They were familiar with its presence. David and all Israel celebrated before the Lord with all their might. The sound of lyres, harps, tambourines, sistrums and cymbals filled the air. The king himself danced before the Ark, leading his people in worship. This was supposed to be the greatest day in Israel's recent history. The procession moved slowly, deliberately. Every step was meant to be savoured. This was a moment of national unity, spiritual renewal, and royal triumph. David had planned everything perfectly, or so he thought. Chapter 2. A sudden tragedy. The road from Kiriath-Jearim to Jerusalem was not particularly long, but it was uneven in places. The cart carrying the Ark moved carefully along the path, surrounded by celebration and song. Then, at a place that would later be remembered as the threshing floor of Naasson, something went wrong. The oxen stumbled. Whether they hit a stone, lost their footing, or simply faltered under the weight, the ancient texts don't specify. What matters is what happened next. The cart lurched. The Ark shifted, and in that moment instinct overpowered instruction. Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the Ark. It was a completely natural response. The kind of thing anyone would do when something precious is about to fall. His hand touched the gold-covered wood, and immediately he fell dead beside the cart. The music stopped. The singing ceased. The celebration died in an instant. One moment, 30,000 people were rejoicing. The next, they stood in stunned silence, staring at a body lying beside the Ark of God. David's reaction was complex. The ancient text says he was angry. Angry at what had happened. Angry at the disruption of his perfect plan. Angry at God for what seemed like a harsh and inexplicable act. But beneath the anger was something deeper. Fear. Pure, overwhelming fear. How could this happen? Uzzah had grown up around the Ark. He had lived in the same house with it for years. His intentions were good. He was trying to protect it, to keep it from falling. And yet, in the instant his hand made contact, he died. The theological questions were immediate and disturbing. If the very presence of God could strike down someone trying to help, how could anyone approach it safely? How could it be moved at all? David had planned this as the crowning achievement of his reign, and now it had become a scene of death and confusion. The king stood there, watching his vision collapse. This was supposed to be a triumphant entry. Instead, it was a funeral. The people looked to him for answers, for direction, for some explanation of what had just occurred. He had none to give. In that moment, David made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue. He couldn't bring this ark into Jerusalem, not after what had just happened. The risk was too great. The fear was too real. Whatever blessing the ark was supposed to bring, the cost seemed too high. The journey stopped. Right there, in the middle of the road, with Jerusalem still miles away, the procession halted. The greatest religious celebration in recent memory ended in tragedy and terror, and David faced a question he hadn't anticipated. What do you do with the presence of God when you're too afraid to receive it? Chapter 3. The ark is stopped. David stood at the threshing floor, his mind racing through possibilities and problems. The ark couldn't go back to where it came from. That would be an admission of complete failure, but it couldn't continue to Jerusalem either. Not now. Not like this. The fear was too fresh, the death too recent, the confusion too profound. The king asked a question that echoed with both fear and honesty. How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? It wasn't rhetorical, defiance. It was genuine confusion. He wanted the presence of God in his city, but he had just witnessed that presence kill a man who simply touched it. The paradox seemed impossible to resolve. The decision had to be made immediately. The ark couldn't remain on the road. It needed shelter, protection, a temporary home while David figured out what had gone wrong and how to proceed safely. But who would take it? Who would be willing to house something that had just demonstrated such terrifying power? The ancient records don't tell us how the choice was made. Was there a discussion? Did someone volunteer? Was a house simply chosen because of proximity? What we know is this. Nearby lived a man named Obed-Edom. He was a Gittite, meaning he came from Gath, one of the Philistine cities. He was part of the community but not native-born Israelite royalty. He had no particular fame, no special status, no recorded acts of heroism or prophetic calling. He was simply a man who lived near the place where the procession had stopped, and his house became the solution to David's problem. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israelite religion, was carried off the road and placed in Obed-Edom's home. Not as an honour, but as a necessity. Not because he was chosen for blessing, but because someone had to take it and his house was available. One can only imagine what Obed-Edom thought when he was told the ark would be staying with him. Did he see it as a privilege or a death sentence? Had he witnessed what happened to Uzzah? Did he know the stories of what had befallen the Philistines when they captured the ark years earlier? The Philistine cities had been ravaged by plagues when they possessed the ark. Tumours broke out among the people. Rats infested their land. The ark had moved from city to city, each one desperate to get rid of it, until finally they sent it back to Israel on a cart pulled by cows, with golden offerings to appease the God of Israel. And now, that same ark was in Obed-Edom's house, the same presence that had struck down Uzzah, the same object that had brought plagues to Philistine cities, sitting in his home, with his family, for an indefinite period of time. David returned to Jerusalem without the ark. The celebration was over, the plans were abandoned, and somewhere in an ordinary house, in the care of an ordinary man, the presence of God waited. 3 months would pass before anyone checked on what was happening there. 3 months of silence, 3 months of the unknown. But in that silence, something extraordinary was occurring, something no one expected, something that would eventually change everything. Chapter 4. Introducing Obed-Edom. Let's pause and consider who this man actually was. In the grand narrative of Scripture, Obed-Edom appears suddenly, serves his purpose, and then fades into the background. Most people reading through 2 Samuel skip right past his name, but his brief appearance tells us something important about how God works. Obed-Edom was not from the priestly line. He wasn't a Levite born into the service of the tabernacle. His name suggests Edomite heritage, and the text explicitly identifies him as a Gittite. Gath was one of the 5 major Philistine cities, famous as the hometown of Goliath. Whether Obed-Edom was ethnically Philistine or simply lived among them is unclear, but what's certain is that he wasn't part of Israel's religious elite. This detail matters. The ark was supposed to be carried by Levites, handled by priests, approached with specific rituals and protocols. The law given to Moses contained explicit instructions about how the ark should be moved, who could touch it, and what precautions were necessary. David had ignored these instructions by placing the ark on a cart, copying the method the Philistines had used to return it years earlier. Now, ironically, the ark ended up in the house of a man from that same Philistine region. God's presence, rejected by the king of Israel out of fear, found temporary residence with someone outside the traditional religious system. Obed-Edom had a household. The text mentions his family later, indicating he had sons who would eventually serve in the temple. He was a working man, probably a farmer or tradesman. He lived a quiet life in a small community on the road between cities. Nothing about his background suggested he was destined for any role in Israel's history. But he had something that mattered more than credentials. He had a home, and he was willing to receive what others feared. When the ark was brought to his house, Obed-Edom faced a choice. He could have refused. He could have pointed to his non-Israelite background, his lack of priestly training, his reasonable fear of what had just happened to Uzzah. He had every logical reason to say no, but he didn't. Whether from faith, duty, or simple obedience to authority, he accepted the responsibility. The ark was placed in his home, and life continued. The sun set that first evening with the ark under his roof. His family went to sleep that night in the same house as the presence of God, and they woke up the next morning still alive. That first day became a second day, the second became a week, the week became a month, and slowly, quietly, without any public announcement or religious ceremony, something began to change in that household. Chapter 5. 3. Quiet months. The text gives us almost no details about those 3 months. No dramatic visions, no angelic appearances, no miracles recorded for posterity. Just this simple statement: the ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. But the absence of detail is itself significant. Silence in Scripture often means normalcy, routine, life continuing as it should. Imagine those first days. The morning after the ark arrived, Obed-Edom probably woke up half surprised to still be breathing. He had seen what happened to Uzzah. He knew the stories of the Philistine plagues. Every morning that he and his family survived must have felt like a small miracle. But as days turned into weeks, something became clear. The ark wasn't there to destroy them. Whatever had gone wrong with Uzzah, whatever had caused that sudden death, wasn't happening in Obed-Edom's house. They went about their daily routines. They worked their fields, prepared their meals, lived their lives, and the ark simply rested there, in whatever room they had designated for it. There was probably a reverence in that household, a care taken not to treat the ark casually, but there was also, gradually, a comfort. The presence of God, honoured properly, wasn't something to fear. It was something that brought peace. The ancient text doesn't tell us if Obed-Edom prayed before the ark, if he worshipped there, if he made offerings. We don't know if he talked about it with his neighbours or kept quiet about the sacred object in his home. What we know is that he treated it with the respect it deserved, maintained his household in righteousness, and let God be God in his home. And slowly changes began to appear. Not dramatic, not obvious at first, but real, tangible, measurable, the kind of changes that neighbours notice, the kind of prosperity that raises questions. His fields began to flourish, whether it was the crops growing more abundantly, the livestock thriving, or both. The productivity of his land increased noticeably. In an agricultural society where everyone's yields were roughly similar, exceptional harvests stood out. People noticed. His household grew more harmonious. Conflicts that might normally arise in any family seemed to resolve more easily. There was peace under his roof. Visitors commented on the atmosphere. Something felt different about his home. His children seemed to thrive. They grew healthy and strong. Whatever blessings flow from a godly household seemed to multiply in his family. Later records show that his sons would go on to positions of service in the temple, suggesting they grew up in an environment that shaped their character positively. And financially, everything seemed to work. Projects succeeded, investments paid off, debts were cleared, the kind of comprehensive household prosperity that makes people wonder what changed, what secret you're holding, what advantage you've gained. But Obed-Edom wasn't holding a secret or working an angle. He was simply living with the presence of God in his home, and that presence, rather than bringing the curse everyone feared, brought blessing in every area of his life. 3 months of quiet faithfulness, 3 months of treating the sacred with reverence, 3 months of simply being willing to house what others were too afraid to receive. And in that time, an unknown man became a walking testimony to a profound truth. God's presence brings blessing to those who honour it. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Blessing. Word travels in small communities. When one household suddenly begins to prosper in every measurable way, people notice, neighbours talk, visitors observe, and eventually news reaches those in authority. The reports that made their way back to David were striking. Obed-Edom's household was flourishing, not just surviving, but thriving. Everything he touched seemed to succeed. His family was at peace, his resources were multiplying, his entire household was blessed, and the blessing was directly connected to one thing. The Ark of God was in his house, the same Ark that had brought death at the threshing floor, the same presence that David had been too afraid to bring to Jerusalem, the same object that had caused plagues in Philistine cities. In Obed-Edom's house, it brought nothing but blessing. This created a profound theological moment for David. The problem hadn't been the ark. The problem hadn't been God's presence being inherently dangerous. The problem had been the improper handling of that presence. The disregard for God's specific instructions about how the ark should be moved and who should carry it. David began to research. He consulted the law. He spoke with priests and Levites, and he discovered what had gone wrong. The ark was never supposed to be on a cart in the first place. That was how the Philistines had returned it, but it wasn't how God had commanded Israel to transport it. The Levites were supposed to carry it on poles inserted through rings on its sides. Specific families had specific duties regarding its care and movement. Uzzah's death wasn't arbitrary divine anger. It was the consequence of approaching holy things in unholy ways. The reverence that should have been shown from the beginning had been replaced with expediency, an imitation of pagan practices. God's presence requires God's protocols. Blessing comes through obedience, not casual approach. But Obed-Edom, intentionally or not, had shown proper reverence. He had treated the ark with respect. He had maintained righteousness in his household. He had honoured the presence of God, and God had honoured him in return. The contrast was stark and instructive. A king with all the resources of Israel had approached God's presence carelessly and experienced tragedy. A common man with no credentials had received that same presence with reverence and experienced comprehensive blessing. The lesson was clear. God's favour isn't determined by status, but by attitude, not by position, but by posture. David heard these reports and something shifted in him. The fear that had paralysed him 3 months earlier gave way to understanding. The confusion about how to approach God's presence resolved into clarity. He knew what had to be done. He knew how to do it correctly. And most importantly, he was ready to try again. But this time, there would be no shortcuts, no copying of pagan methods, no dismissal of God's specific instructions. This time, if the ark was to come to Jerusalem, it would come the way God had prescribed from the beginning, with Levites carrying it, with proper sacrifices, with worship that honoured not just God's presence, but God's procedures. Obed-Edom had done more than house the ark. He had demonstrated something David needed to see, that God's presence is safe when God's ways are honoured, that blessing isn't withheld from those who approach the holy with proper reverence, that even someone outside the traditional religious establishment could experience God's favour by simply treating sacred things as sacred. The 3 months had served their purpose. They had been a pause in the journey, yes, but they had also been a lesson, a demonstration, a proof that the problem wasn't God's desire to bless his people. The problem was his people's failure to approach him correctly. Now David understood. and he was ready to finish what he had started. The ark would come to Jerusalem. But this time, everything would be different. Chapter 7. News reaches the king. The reports that reached David's palace were consistent and compelling. Messengers from the region around Obed-Edom's house all told variations of the same story. The household was blessed. Remarkably, comprehensively, undeniably blessed. And the blessing had begun exactly when the ark arrived. David must have felt a complex mixture of emotions hearing this news. Relief that the ark hadn't brought destruction to another household. Vindication that God's presence was meant to bless, not curse. But also perhaps a twinge of regret. 3 months of blessing had gone to someone else's house. 3 months of God's manifest presence had been in a small home on the outskirts of his kingdom rather than in his capital city where he had planned to house it. But more than any personal feelings, David saw opportunity. The pause had served its purpose. The question that had paralysed him, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me, now had an answer. It could come through obedience, through proper protocol, through reverence combined with joy. David assembled his advisors, priests and Levites. He explained what had happened and what he had learned. The ark was to be moved again, but this time according to God's explicit instructions. The Levites from the families of Kohath, who were designated to carry the holy objects of the tabernacle, would bear the ark on their shoulders using the poles designed for that purpose. No cart, no shortcuts, no improvisation. Sacrifices would be made, not as appeasement for past mistakes, but as worship offered in proper sequence. Every 6 steps the procession would stop and offerings would be made to God. The journey wouldn't be rushed. It would be deliberate, reverent, and filled with worship at every stage. David also made personal preparations. He would dance before the ark again, but this time wearing a linen ephod like a priest, identifying himself not primarily as king but as a worshipper. The celebration would be even greater than the first attempt, but the approach would be fundamentally different. Joy combined with reverence, celebration grounded in obedience. Word was sent to Obed-Edom. The ark would be leaving his house. The 3 months had ended. The presence of God was moving to its intended destination. For Obed-Edom, this must have been bittersweet news. The blessing of those months had been extraordinary. His household had experienced prosperity unlike anything before. But the ark had never been meant to stay permanently. It had always been passing through. The day arrived for the ark to continue its journey. David came personally, along with priests, Levites, musicians, and a crowd of worshippers. The atmosphere was different from that first attempt. There was still joy, still celebration, still music and dancing, but there was also a reverence that had been missing before, an understanding that they were handling something holy, something that required specific protocols, something that demanded respect. The Levites lifted the ark onto their shoulders. The poles rested on their shoulders as God had prescribed. They began to walk, and after 6 steps the procession stopped. Sacrifices were offered, worship was given, and then they continued. 6 more steps, another sacrifice, more worship. The journey that had been interrupted by death now continued, marked by worship at every stage. David danced before the ark with all his might. The text emphasizes his complete abandon in worship. This wasn't dignified royal ceremony, this was uninhibited joy. A king celebrating not his own power, but the presence of God among his people. The same David who had feared the ark 3 months earlier now celebrated its presence with everything in him. The procession moved through the countryside toward Jerusalem. People lined the route. The sound of trumpets, singing and shouting filled the air. This time there was no stumbling, no death, no fear. Just the steady progress of God's presence moving toward its rightful place in the centre of Israel's capital. And somewhere in that crowd, probably near the front given his recent role, was Obed-Edom. His part in the story was ending, or so it might have seemed. The ark was leaving his house. The extraordinary season of blessing was transitioning to something else. But his story wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Chapter 8. The journey resumes. The second attempt to bring the Ark to Jerusalem succeeded in ways the first could never have matched. Yes, the Ark reached its destination, which was the practical goal, but more importantly, the process itself became an act of worship that taught Israel something profound about approaching God. Every 6 steps the procession stopped. Bulls and fattened calves were sacrificed. The smell of burning offerings filled the air. Prayers were lifted. Songs were sung. The journey that might have been completed in hours took much longer because worship was integrated into every stage. The destination mattered, but so did the journey. Getting the Ark to Jerusalem was the goal, but getting there correctly was equally important. David's dancing was legendary. The text describes it as dancing with all his might. This wasn't a few dignified steps. This was a king completely lost in worship, unconcerned with royal dignity, focused entirely on honouring God's presence. Later, his wife Michal would criticise him for it, saying he had disgraced himself by dancing so freely before the people. David's response revealed his heart. He was willing to become even more undignified than this in his worship of God. The musicians played with skill and passion. Trumpets, harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums and cymbals created a sound of celebration that could be heard throughout the region. This wasn't background music. This was a symphony of worship, a concert of praise, a declaration through sound that God's presence was returning to dwell among his people. As the procession entered Jerusalem, the entire city came out to witness the moment. From the youngest children to the oldest elders, people lined the streets. The Ark moved through the city streets, carried on the shoulders of Levites, surrounded by worship, headed toward the tent David had prepared for it on Mount Zion. Finally, the Ark reached its destination. It was placed inside the tent. More sacrifices were offered. Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings were presented before the Lord. And then David did something remarkable. He blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty and gave gifts to everyone present. Men and women alike received portions of bread, dates, and raisins. The king celebrated God's presence by generously blessing his people. The Ark was home. The journey that had started months earlier, that had been interrupted by tragedy and delayed by fear, was complete. God's presence now dwelt in the heart of Jerusalem, in the city David had established as Israel's capital. The physical and spiritual centres of the nation were now aligned, but the story doesn't end there, because woven into the fabric of this triumph was the quiet faithfulness of a man who had made it all possible, a man who had bridged the gap between fear and faith, a man who had demonstrated that God's presence brings blessing when properly honoured. Chapter 9. Obed-Edom's lasting legacy. In the biblical narrative, many people appear briefly and then vanish from the record. They serve their purpose in the story and disappear back into history. Obed-Edom could have been one of these people. His role was over. The Ark had left his house. The blessing he experienced during those 3 months could have been the entirety of his legacy. But that's not what happened. Later passages of scripture reveal that Obed-Edom's story continued, and in a beautiful way. He didn't return to obscurity. Instead, he was brought into service at the very centre of Israel's worship. 1 Chronicles records that Obed-Edom and his sons became gatekeepers for the sanctuary. This wasn't a minor position. Gatekeepers controlled access to the sacred spaces. They ensured that those who entered were supposed to be there and that they approached with proper reverence. They protected the holy from the profane, the sacred from the common. It was a position of significant trust and responsibility. Think about the symmetry of this. A man who had faithfully guarded the Ark in his home for 3 months was now entrusted with guarding the sanctuary where the Ark resided. His private faithfulness became public service. His quiet obedience became recognised ministry. The text also records that Obed-Edom's sons served alongside him. 68 of his descendants are mentioned in Chronicles as serving in various capacities related to the temple and its worship. The blessing that began when the Ark entered his house extended through generations. His faithfulness created a legacy that outlasted him. This wasn't about Obed-Edom seeking position or reward. Nothing in the text suggests he asked for this role or campaigned for recognition. Rather, David recognized what God had already revealed, that Obed-Edom was a man who knew how to honor God's presence, that he understood reverence, that he could be trusted with sacred things. The man from Gath, the outsider with no priestly lineage, became part of Israel's ongoing worship. His house had been blessed. Now his service would be a blessing to others. The presence that had dwelt in his home temporarily became the focus of his life permanently. There's something profoundly encouraging about this outcome. Obed-Edom didn't perform miracles. He didn't receive prophetic visions. He didn't conquer enemies or write scripture. He simply said yes when the ark needed a place to stay. He honored what was holy. He maintained righteousness in his household. And from that, simple obedience flowed blessing that extended far beyond those 3 months. His story reminds us that God sees faithfulness even when no one else is watching, that obscure obedience matters, that the way we handle what God entrusts to us, even temporarily, reveals our character and positions us for future service. Obed-Edom could have complained that he was being burdened with a responsibility he didn't ask for. He could have resented that his house was chosen out of necessity rather than honor. He could have worried about the risk rather than embracing the opportunity. Instead, he simply received what God placed in his care and honored it appropriately. And that choice, that simple, faithful choice, transformed his family's trajectory for generations. The blessing wasn't just material prosperity during those 3 months. The blessing was becoming part of something larger, something eternal. His name is written in Scripture. His faithfulness is recorded for all time. His descendants served in God's house, all because he opened his door when others were closing theirs, all because he said yes when fear would have prompted no, all because he honored the presence of God rather than fearing it. Epilogue: when God dwells with the willing. The story of Obed-Edom sits quietly in Scripture, easily overlooked between the larger narratives of King David's triumphs and failures. But within its brief telling lies a truth that echoes through every generation. God's presence brings blessing to those who receive it with reverence. Consider the progression of this story. It begins with celebration turned to tragedy. A well-meaning man dies for touching what he shouldn't have touched. Fear replaces joy. The journey stops because no one knows how to proceed safely. The presence of God becomes something people fear rather than desire. Then comes a man no one would have chosen, someone from the margins, someone with no credentials or special calling, someone who was simply available when opportunity or responsibility knocked on his door. He receives what others feared, he houses what others rejected, and in his faithful obscurity he experiences blessing that reaches the king's attention. Finally, the journey resumes, but now it's different. Now there's understanding. Now there's proper reverence combined with joyful worship. Now the protocols are followed, and God's presence reaches its intended destination, not despite the delay, but perhaps because of it. The 3-month pause with Obed-Edom wasn't a failure of David's plan. It was part of God's plan, a demonstration, a lesson, a testimony. What can we learn from this ancient story? Perhaps this: that God is less interested in our resumes than our willingness, that he honours humble obedience more than impressive credentials, that his presence transforms ordinary households into blessed households when received with reverence. Obed-Edom didn't seek the ark. It came to him. He didn't ask for blessing. It flowed from honouring what was entrusted to him. He didn't campaign for recognition. It came as a natural result of faithfulness. His entire legacy began with a simple act of receiving what God placed in his care and treating it with proper respect. There's encouragement here for anyone who feels ordinary, overlooked, or outside the circles of influence and importance. God's greatest blessings often come to those who aren't seeking the spotlight, but are simply faithful in the shadows. The house that receives God's presence with reverence becomes the house God blesses, regardless of its size, status, or location. There's also a warning here. The same presence that blessed Obed-Edom struck down Uzzah. The difference wasn't God's mood or arbitrary preference. The difference was the approach. Sacred things require sacred handling. God's presence is a blessing when honoured and a danger when treated casually. Reverence isn't optional, it's essential, but perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that God's plans aren't derailed by our failures or delays. David's fear and confusion didn't stop God's purpose. The 3-month pause didn't prevent the ark from reaching Jerusalem. Instead, that pause created an opportunity for an unknown man to be blessed, and for all Israel to learn a crucial lesson about how to approach the holy. Sometimes what looks like delay is actually preparation. Sometimes what feels like failure is actually education. Sometimes the detours teach us what the straight path never could. Obed-Edom's house was blessed because he was willing to receive what others feared. His legacy extended beyond his lifetime because he was faithful with what he was given. His name is remembered because he said yes when yes was costly and uncertain. The question for us isn't whether we'll have opportunities to house God's presence in some literal, physical way. The question is whether we'll receive what God places in our care, whatever form that takes, with the reverence it deserves. Whether we'll honour the sacred in the midst of the ordinary. Whether we'll be faithful in obscurity, trusting that God sees and honours quiet obedience. God often blesses the homes willing to receive him quietly, not the ones seeking recognition, not the ones demanding explanation, but the ones that simply open their doors and say, "Whatever you bring, Lord, I'll honour it." That's the legacy of Obed-Edom. That's the lesson of his story. And that's the invitation extended to every person in every generation, to be the kind of dwelling, literal or metaphorical, where God's presence feels at home, where reverence and faithfulness create the conditions for blessing, where ordinary obedience leads to extraordinary grace. The ark eventually left Obed-Edom's house, but the blessing it brought never truly left. It marked his family for generations. It changed his destiny. It wrote his name into sacred history, all because when God's presence needed a home, he was willing to provide one. May we all have the courage to open our doors when others are closing theirs. May we have the faithfulness to honour what God entrusts to us. May we have the wisdom to recognise that his presence is not something to fear, but something to receive with joy and reverence. And may we discover, as Obed-Edom did, that when God dwells with the willing, blessing flows in ways we never imagined possible.